Hello everyone! In this tutorial, we will learn all about the naming conventions and the retention area of the CBE. These two tools are essential for standardizing information, organizing projects, and optimizing your workflow. Let's start by accessing the common data environment of our project. We can access the retention area through the menu on the left side. As we can see, this page is blank. This happens because we haven't defined any naming convention within our CDE yet. The very first step to creating a naming convention is navigating to the project settings. To do this, you need to go to the top menu and access the project settings. Now, from the menu on the left side, let's access the project attributes. Veeam Workplace already comes with some predefined fields by default, such as areas, disciplines, and status. Our primary focus in this tutorial is to create the essential attributes or building blocks for our file name, which we will then use to create our complete naming convention. To create a new attribute, just go to the options bar and click on New. Simply imagine that you need to develop and create a naming convention based on these elements. Before creating a new attribute, it's important to understand the strategy behind the types of fields available. When you click on New, some options appear. First, you can give this attribute a name. Then, you will need to carefully select the type of attribute. Here, we can choose between a text attribute, a multiple choice attribute, or a date attribute. You should use the text field whenever the information is entirely distinct and unique for each document, such as a free-form title, a sequential number, or a numeric value. It requires an entry but accepts any type of information entered. The multiple choice type, on the other hand, should be used for fields that require consistency, such as fields that define subjects, file types, or stages. It forces the user to choose a predetermined code, ensuring that all the information is standardized and 100% searchable. The date field is an excellent related attribute. It is used to track information such as the delivery deadline or the approval date. Since this is a free text field, let's choose this attribute as the text type. Now you can simply add a description to your item. And then we should carefully select and configure the character settings, which can be defined as having an unlimited length, a fixed length, or constrained within a specified character range. In this case, we'll leave it as unlimited. Now, for the character type, we can choose between alphanumeric, numeric, or alphabetic. In this case, I'll allow it to be alphanumeric. With all the data filled in, we can create our attribute. Now let's create a new attribute for naming the subject. In this case, we need the user to choose a fixed code. So let's go ahead and set the specific type. Let's add a description for the attribute. Now let's define which items will be inside this attribute. Shall we create one for architecture? To add another item, just go to the Active tab, 8s, and then simply click the Add button here. Now let's add the item for structural design. And apply. This way, we've created an attribute that will only accept these two types of responses. In the same way we created the subject attribute, let's create the phase attribute. Just as we created the project attribute, let's create the specific version attribute. Now, let's create a field called revision. And in it, we'll add a limited number of characters. Let's also create an attribute called delimitation. And finally, an attribute of the date type, for example, one that stores dates. With all the attributes successfully created, we can now use the left side menu to navigate to the naming standard area. Here, through the ribbon interface, you can easily and conveniently create a new naming standard for your project. Now, with the naming standard created, the ribbon provides you with access to a variety of different features, such as renaming, deleting, duplicating, or manually applying this type of naming standard to a folder. Here, we can define how the attributes will be separated, which can be done using periods or hyphens. In this case, we chose to use the hyphen. Within the naming standard, you can use the attributes in two ways. One is through the naming convention, and the other is by means of related attributes. A related attribute is used to track specific information such as the delivery deadline, approval date, or revision number. Let's bring together the attributes we previously established to construct our naming standard rule. Let's begin by adding the static attributes through the naming convention. Here, I will select project, discipline, phase, version, and delimitation, for example, in this context. Through this specific sidebar, next to the attribute names, we can organize the order. So I'll leave the version attribute for last. Having finished selecting all the static QM attributes, at this point, let's select the related attributes. which are those associated with other elements. The specific date attribute will never actually appear as being selected in the naming convention section. This happens because the file name, once defined, needs to be static. If a date field were part of the naming convention, with every new revision or adjustment, the file name would change. This would break traceability, which defeats version control and can cause major conflicts within the CD. Therefore, you should utilize the date only for metadata tracking and keep the naming convention static, focusing exclusively on content identification. In this case, I will add only the revision attribute to this type of naming convention, 01. With that done, we have our complete naming convention with all the necessary attributes we need. Now, using the options bar, I will select and choose a directory folder within my CD where I will add this naming convention. Now, let's go back to our CDR. Now we can see that our retention area already has notifications. This situation occurred because, after applying the standardized naming convention to that folder, the files that were there and did not comply with the convention were moved to this area. For these specific files to leave the retention area, they need to be validated now. To do this, you must select a file and click on Validate. You also have the option to delete the file. We can select the desired file and in the options bar, choose to edit all of them. Let's name the project according to our naming convention. Now just click on Apply. Now in the options bar, you will apply it again. Let's do this for all the files. Now that we've adjusted all the names, let's go back to our home screen. We can see that the specific folder B, Execution, where we added the naming convention, already displays a visible indicator. When you hover the mouse over the symbol, we can see exactly which naming convention was applied to that folder. Let's do a naming convention test. For that, I'll add a new version of this file. We can see that the name is the same except for the revision. We can see that the version was updated automatically. Now let's establish a new naming convention, using the data attribute we created in the previous step. We're going back to our CDN. For this demonstration, let's apply the naming convention directly from our CDE. To do this, navigate to and access the folder menu where you want to apply the naming convention. Then go to More and select Apply Naming Convention. Now, you can choose which convention you want to apply. In this case, we will apply convention 2. Now let's add a file following the folder's standard naming convention. As we can see, the file was directed to the folder without needing to go through the retention area. That's because the file has the correct naming convention. Now let's add a file with an incorrect name. The file is automatically added to the retention area. The naming convention is a tool that turns your documents into consistent data